Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. This week, Think Tank is joined by the distinguished writer, editor, and literary critic, Norman Podhoretz. Podhoretz was editor-in-chief of the Neoconservative magazine Commentary for 35 years. Now a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, he is the author of a new book called Exfriends, Falling Out with Allen Ginsberg, Lionel and Diana Trilling, Lillian Hellman, Hannah Arendt, and Norman Mailer. The topic before the House, intellectuals at war. This week on Think Tank. Norman Podhoretz, thank you for joining us on Think Tank.
Delighted to be here.
Your book is about what you call the family. Could you tell us, for those of us who are uninitiated in this language, what you're talking about?
The family, which is a coined term by the late columnist Murray Kempton, refers to a group of intellectuals centered in New York from the 30s up through the late 60s, I guess, when it began to disintegrate. These were people who wrote for what used to be called highbrow magazines like Partisan Review, Commentary, later Dissent, The Public Interest. They tended to be people in the broadest sense of the left.
Of the political left.
Yeah. Political left,
right.
But in a certain sense the cultural left as well, because they were partisans of the modernist movement in the arts, and they were as passionate about the arts as they were about politics. Many of them were ex-communists who became anti-communists of the left, of varying stripes. I mean, some were Trotskyists and then ex-Trotskyists, some were anarchists, some were social democrats, some were liberals.
Mostly Jewish?
Mostly Jewish, but not as Jewish as the legend has it. I mean, there are a good many prominent non-Jewish members of this family.
Dwight MacDonald.
Mary McCarthy, right. Robert Lowell, William Barrett, F.W. Dupee, I could go on. But many were Jewish, yes.
Right. So the family was about arts and politics. You are in your original incarnation, a literary critic. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to begin by reading a quote from Tom Wolfe's book, A Man in Full. Toward the end of it, the hero runs into a almost antique professor of English down in Georgia, and the guy is rambling on about the non-importance of literature. And he's talking to him, and he says, this is the professor speaking, he says, entire civilizations are founded without any literature at all and without anybody missing it. It's only later on, when there's a big enough class of indolent drones to write the stuff and read the stuff, that you have literature. When I saw all those eager hands sticking up as I taught, I always wanted to tell them what I've just told you. But what right did I have to play iconoclast after making a living my whole life taking it seriously, or at least with a straight face?
Well, Tom Wolfe, of course, is making fun of that professor. He's not endorsing those sentiments. On the contrary, he is a passionate believer in the importance of literature, although he opposes certain tendencies in modern literature and has sort of single-handedly taken on the entire literary establishment. But I agree with Tom.
You think he is spoofing that guy, not making a point that has, in his judgment, a core of elemental truth to it?
I have no doubt that he's spoofing this character. Otherwise, his own career would make no sense whatsoever. I mean, his highest aspiration for the last, 20 years has been to write novels and to revive what he considers a moribund form of the novel. I mean, what the professor says is true. There are entire civilizations without literature. There are entire civilizations without the wheel. I mean, the question is how important a given cultural phenomenon, a given cultural sector is to the individual lives of people in a given society.
Let's go from the literary aspect of this group of intellectuals in New York to the political aspect. Give me a little background and tell me why you think this particular group was important.
Well, the main reason it was important is that it spent day and night arguing what were the life and death issues of our century and what were life and death issues to them, intellectually speaking. I'm talking about the nature of totalitarianism, the question of how to judge the Soviet Union in relation to this concept of totalitarianism, the nature and character of American society, the rights and wrongs of the Cold War, all of these questions.
Capitalism later.
Later on, capitalism, and you're right to stress later, because almost everybody was either a socialist or an anti-capitalist, though not necessarily a socialist. It was only much later that people began embracing it. Myself included. I came late to the belief that capitalism, as Milton Friedman said, is itself a form of freedom, and also the precondition for the creation of prosperity. It took me a long time to come to that realization, which I hold to very firmly now. Almost nobody in the family took that view. The view was generally...
But Norman, people in America took that view. I mean, Sinclair Lewis makes fun of George Babbitt, but George Babbitt is espousing sort of a heartland capitalism that 80 years later, intellectuals in New York, some of them say, that's a pretty good idea. Aren't I wonderful that I thought of it? And the same with the Cold War. I mean, the view about the Soviet Union being a threat, a major threat, was enunciated by Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower and John Kennedy and my hero, our hero for a while, I guess, Scoop Jackson, and a lot of other people.
Well, these were people operating in the political realm who implemented policy. But before they did so, there were many years of debate and analysis of the phenomenon that they finally, and I say finally, came to recognize as the kind of threat it actually was. And this debate was conducted through books and through verbal arguments. And it had to do with defining what the true reality of the Soviet Union was. As you know, there were many apologists for the Soviet system, many defenders of it, including important politicians, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vice president, Henry Wallace, whom we narrowly escaped having as president, which would have been a calamity, I think. So the point is that you had a figure like...
Harry Truman was not educated and shaped by intellectuals in New York.
No, on the contrary. But I think there is a kind of trickle-down effect in the culture, as there is in the economy. Ideas, in my judgment, are the moving forces of history. I'm the opposite of a Marxist. I don't think it's the economy, stupid, that drives history. I think it's ideas in the heads of men. And one of the best things, John Maynard Keynes, I'm not a great admirer of his, but one of the best things he ever said is that practical men who think that they are not influenced by ideas always turn out to be the slaves of the ideas of some defunct economist. I would say add philosopher, poet. Shelley said poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world. That's an exaggeration. But the attitudes that most people carried around have their source in debates among philosophers of whom they've never heard. They don't come out of nowhere.
What about the idea that this process doesn't go on as trickle down, but as bubble up? That the people understood the evils of totalitarianism. I mean, you have this huge ethnic population in the United States who, by the grapevine, of their people in Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union knew damn well what was happening. Didn't Susan Sontag write that when she finally partially turned the corner, that you would have learned more about the Soviet Union
from the Reader's
Digest, which had a circulation of 20 million people, than from all the combined intellectual...
Well, what she failed to say was that where the Reader's Digest learned it was from Max Eastman, who had been an ex-communist intellectual and translator of Trotsky. The answer to your question is yes and no. I mean, I'm a great believer in the common sense of the American people, and I'm a great believer in Bill Buckley's classical dictum, I'd rather be ruled by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than by the combined faculties of Harvard and MIT. So I won't argue populism with you. I will, however, say that the people on their own, as it were, the voters on their own, don't have a glorious record in this context. I mean,
more glorious than the intellectuals.
Yeah, well, I don't know. That would be hard to measure. But conscription passed in 1940 or 41 by one vote. The tie was broken by the vice president.
The draft, right?
The draft,
right,
yeah.
Right.
So there was a great reluctance, popular reluctance, to take on Nazi Germany, the first form of totalitarianism against which we fought. There was a very mixed response later in the early days of the Cold War, and certainly in the latter part of the Korean War, which grew out of the policy of containment, and of course then there was enormous opposition mounted to the Vietnam War in its later phases.
These arguments that you describe in your book, Exfriends, were particularly intense in New York. I mean, we had these arguments in Washington all the time, and yet, maybe I'm blindsided by it, but people remained fairly cordial and fairly friendly because they had to do business on a lot of other things. I mean, agriculture policy.
Well, you've just given the answer. They had to do business on a lot of things. It's also part of the art of politics to obfuscate differences in order to make it possible to cooperate. And even somebody like Joe McCarthy, it is said, would run into someone he'd been harassing or ruining at a committee hearing, run into this guy in the elevator, throw his arm around him and say, "It's nothing personal, let's go have a drink." Well, I mean, I would have decked the guy, Now, intellectuals don't play the game that way. Intellectuals feel it their duty, and I agree with this view, to sharpen and clarify differences, not to obfuscate or muddle them, in order to understand what the logic of a particular view leads to.
But does that mean getting bitter and personal about it? Because that's what some of that comes through in the book.
I'm always asked that question, and my answer is that if you take ideas with the kind of seriousness that the people I write about, and that I myself always did, as I say, they were matters almost of life and death. They were held with a religious intensity. When basic differences of opinion begin to emerge, it becomes extremely difficult to maintain civil or cordial relations, because when you meet, you have two possibilities. You can either bite your tongue so you won't get into a nasty fight, therefore evading the issues that most interest you, or you can fight all the time over these issues, and these fights get to be intense because, as I say, they're held with great religious passion. So it becomes less and less pleasant to have relations, and either you drift apart, which is what happened in most cases.
Doesn't that lead then to a certain parochialism? You hang out with your guys, they hang out with their guys, and all you do is take in each other's laundry instead of getting the blend that many of us would think is the source of wisdom?
Well, it can lead to, I wouldn't call it parochialism, I would call it sectarianism, and it can lead to sectarianism, except that you are always free, and what's more, you have an obligation to keep at least reading what the other guys are saying, and to make yourself aware of what the opposing arguments are. And this is something I've always attempted to do. both to my own profit, but because it was necessary, particularly if you're conducting what amounts to a war, against a set of ideas.
A war against your ex-friends.
Yeah, once they became ex-friends.
Norman Mailer. Let's just go through some of the quick capsules from the book. Norman Mailer.
Yes. He and I were very, very close friends for something like 15 years, and we finally broke basically over political issues, over our conflicting attitudes toward the Cold War. As I moved toward the right, and as I more and more began to see the importance of resisting Soviet expansionism, he was going even further in the other direction and was enormously upset by this change in me.
How about Lillian Hellman?
Well,
Same deal?
Lillian Hellman was the same thing happened, though. There it was complicated by the fact that she had been a Stalinist, and even at my most radical, I was an anti-Stalinist. We avoided politics for a long time, and were kind of playmates. We had a lot of fun together. But when I began attacking the New Left, of which I had been one of the founding fathers intellectually, this was toward the end of the 60s, we began getting into unpleasant conversations and finally drifted apart.
One more. How about Allen Ginsberg?
Well, he and I went all the way back to college, and we met at Columbia. We were never close friends, but what happened with Allen, even though we drifted apart physically, we'd run into each other from time to time. He seemed to me to stand for everything that was destructive and damaging, especially to the children of this country. The encouragement of the use of drugs, the encouragement of promiscuous sex, especially of promiscuous homosexual sex, which he regarded as superior to straight sex. And that eventually led to the outbreak of AIDS. The encouragement of a contempt for this country, and the encouragement as his friend Timothy Leary put it, to turn on, turn out, drop, turn on, turn off, drop out, or whatever it was. In other words, refuse to take your place as a responsible member.
Turn on, tune in, drop out, something, whatever it was.
Refuse to take your place as a responsible member of the society. And I was fighting against all of that. I later discovered from interviews he gave and from things he wrote, including up to almost the moment he died, that he'd been conducting an imaginary battle with me in his head, especially when he was under the influence of certain drugs. I would appear to him in a vision, and he would fight with me about poetry, about America, and he finally said that even though he had hated me for many years, he finally forgave me. And I had become a sacred figure to him, but I never forgave him, because I think he did a lot of harm.
Norman, you make the case toward the end of the book that the family in New York, those who went in a neoconservative direction, had a significant impact on the policy of the Reagan administration. How, I mean, Ronald Reagan was not a neocon. George Bush was not a neocon.
Well, he was, by the way.
Well, I mean, but he didn't come out of that.
No,
that's not what shaped him.
I would say he was the first neocon in a way. He was a Democrat who moved at the age of 51 into the Republican Party. He started on the left and moved toward the right. That's sort of fundamental definition of what a neoconservative is. But anyway, go ahead.
I mean, but in terms of, I don't think he was influenced, or not visibly so, by the arguments that you're talking about, nor was George Bush, nor was Caspar Weinberger, nor was George Shultz, and you can go down a long list of the Cold Warriors.
No, I would say.
So where was, I mean, I don't want to argue, I want to understand, where was this influence?
Well, that's not as hard a question to answer as you may think. First of all, what I claim and what I think is true is that starting in about 1972, the neoconservative intellectuals helped to create a change in the climate of opinion in this country, particularly on military issues, military buildup, the Soviet threat.
That was when that infamous and famous organization, the Coalition for a Democratic Majority, was
well,
formed, and we were involved
made up of intellectuals, right. And
but mostly Washington, mostly Washington
the Committee
types,
for the Present Danger. Yeah, but the idea spread through magazines like Commentary, mainly through Commentary, I would have to say.
Well,
that created a climate of opinion that made possible the election of someone holding the kinds of views Ronald Reagan held. Although I have to say that Ronald Reagan himself, by all reports, did actually read some of the stuff I'm talking about, including a couple of my own books. He certainly read an article by Jean Kirkpatrick in Commentary called Dictatorships and Double Standards, which led to her appointment
But
as
Jean Kirkpatrick and her husband go back in Democratic politics.
Sure.
I mean, Evron Kirkpatrick taught Hubert Humphrey at the University of Minnesota. Jean worked in Humphrey's 1968 campaign.
But Jean,
she was not created whole cloth.
No, but Jean's article, Dictatorships and Double Standards, appeared in Commentary,
right.
And it was through that article that she came to Ronald Reagan's attention.
And Moynihan's...
and Moynihan earlier in the United States. They both got their jobs through Commentary at the UN. Now, the other point I would make about the influence on the Reagan administration, which from my money was never great enough, came through his appointments. My memory isn't what it used to be, but there were at least half a dozen, I would say, important members of the Reagan administration who had been more or less recruited from among the ranks of the neoconservative intellectuals, including many who were regular contributors to Commentary.
Including your son-in-law, Elliot Abrams.
Including Elliot Abrams, including, I mentioned Jean already, including Richard Pipes, including Edward Lutwak. As I say, my memory is...
Right.
I mean, we could go on. You could probably name a few others.
The case you make is that these people, the family, were so influential in fighting the left is because they were of the left.
Talking about the neoconservatives.
The neoconservatives.
Neoconservatives are a split from the family.
Yeah, okay. Let's talk about the
if you like.
Okay, let's talk about the neoconservative heresy. Okay. You maintain that they were so influential because they had been of the left.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Right.
When we came along...
Not me. You.
Okay.
Right, okay.
When we came along, our arguments against the left were much more effective than the arguments that had been made by traditional conservatives like Bill Buckley and the people around the National Review, who really didn't know the enemy as well as we did. We knew where the vulnerabilities were. We knew exactly what the case was that had to be refuted. And the left, by this time, was like an old prize fighter, a champ who hadn't had a serious contender for a long time and had lost his timing and his rhythm. They were completely bewildered by this assault. They could easily brush off the assault from the right, but they truly, to use a phrase Nathan Glazer once used in a different context, they couldn't remember the answers by now. And we won those arguments partly because they were out of shape intellectually, but partly because we were right.
But is the moral of the story that in order to be influential, you have to be wrong first?
No, that's not the moral of the story.
But that's what you're describing.
No, I'm saying in a particular situation, this was the case. I wouldn't extrapolate it into a general philosophical principle. No, but I do think that this explains why we had the effect that we had, the disproportionate effect that we had when you consider how tiny our numbers were, at least to begin with. We were like in those movies, the 6 cavalrymen being attacked by 1,000 Indians, and they would run from one rock to another to try to fool the Indians into thinking that there were more of them than there were. Well, that's how it was with us around the year 1970.
I used to say in those eras that they attacked with a blizzard of letterheads, that they would defeat communism with a bunch of little organizations, which a lot of that happened. Thank you very much for joining us, Norman Podhoretz. And thank you. We encourage feedback from our viewers. It's very important to us. Talk to us via email or snail mail. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org, and please let us know where you watch Think Tank. This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.